trying to paint this picture of like all intersex people want to not be intersex without any proof. And now you're saying that like, oh, intersex is always going to be harmful without proof, when I'm showing you that yes, there do exist intersex conditions that don't require any medical intervention and that they live normal, happy, healthy lives. Really happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me on, and happy to get into it.
So, are you trans or I mean, you said you're trans, but are I seen that you also say you was non-binary in your bio. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I am both transgender and non-binary.
Okay, because I was kind of confused at first. I in the title I had put that you were transgender. Then I was like, maybe Naomi might think that's disrespectful, so let me put non-binary. So I wasn't sure.
Not at all. Those categories are in no way mutually exclusive. So it is very much possible to be both transgender and non-binary.
I never knew that. Could you explain that for us?
Yeah, so broadly speaking, the term transgender would refer to somebody whose gender identity, being a self perception, differs than the gender they were assigned at birth. So when I'm saying something like gender assigned at birth, what I'm referring to is when you're born, the doctors are going to put either male or female on your birth certificate, sometimes intersex. With that information, parents will typically raise that kid as either a boy or a girl. They'll treat them with different, social expectations, often explicitly, although even more so often implicitly, where they might subtly treat boys and girls kind of different and expect them to behave different ways, perhaps limit or encourage them to, play with certain toys, do certain behaviors, clubs, sports, all those kind of things. We often treat boys and girls very differently. And so a transgender person would be somebody who, later in life would realize, kind of this gender that was assigned to me, be it boy or girl, that's just really not right for me. And so I would like to live my life as a different gender. I would like to socially transition, perhaps change my name, pronouns, that kind of thing. That would broadly be what a transgender person is. And then non-binary in particular refers to a gender identity, one which falls outside of the traditional binary conception of man or woman. If someone says that they're non-binary, it's not necessarily saying anything about their biology, and it's also not necessarily saying anything about how people kind of perceive and treat them, but rather it's just how they see themselves, as in terms of kind of how they would place themselves socially among other peoples, how they perceive themselves as a human being, as a person, kind of falls not entirely man or woman.
So you were born male, correct?
I was assigned male at birth. That is correct.
So how could you be trans and non-binary at the same time in the simplest form?
Like I said, transgender refers to a gender identity, as
Okay.
does non-binary. When I was raised as a kid, my parents treated me as a boy. They didn't treat me as a non-binary person. So by having this self-perception of myself as a non-binary person, by having this gender identity which differs than the gender that I was treated as growing up, then I would, by definition, be both transgender and non-binary.
Oh, so are all transgender people non-binary?
Not necessarily. I think that categorically speaking, if you're a non-binary person, unless you were assigned non-binary at birth by your parents, then yeah, you would be transgender under that common definition of transgender.
Oh, so all non-binary people are transgender.
Yes, it's like squares and
Okay, so
rectangles. You gotta get the ordering right if you're gonna say all is one.
okay, so that's where I was confused. You're by definition of being non-binary, you're transgender.
Yes, yes.
What makes you non-binary?
Like I said,
Yeah.
it's a self-perception. It has to do with one's gender identity, which is your psychosocial relationship to this social phenomenon of gender. So if you're somebody who sees yourself as falling outside of this societal notion of man or woman, then you identify that way, then that would be what a non-binary person
How
is.
do you see yourself that way? How could you feel that you're that way? What is that feeling coming from? How do you know that you feel that
For
way?
me personally, I just see myself as not entirely man or woman. And, I obviously see myself as kind of more on the feminine side of things, but just not entirely woman. And so I would say that I'm a non-binary
Are
person.
you judging that based off how feminine you are or and masculine you are? Is that how you figure so?
It certainly can fall into kind of how people might perceive themselves as non-binary, but it doesn't necessarily have to. There are absolutely non-binary people who are very feminine. There are absolutely non-binary people who are very masculine. But rather, the core part of being non-binary would be viewing oneself, particularly not entirely as a man or a woman. It's your own psychological state in relation to these social categories of man and women, which broadly exist in society.
I really haven't watched your channel. Someone
Mhm.
suggested you to me, so I don't really know. I know some people they may agree with certain things, so I'm going to ask you what's your views on certain
Yeah,
things.
I'm happy to get into
All
it.
right, so Oh, what are your pronouns?
I use she, they
Do you
pronouns.
think it's disrespectful for me to call you him or
Yeah,
he?
I would say that's disrespectful.
Why is it
It's
disrespectful?
the same reason why if somebody had like a nickname and they really wanted you to call them that nickname, but you insisted on not calling them that nickname, it'd be kind of weird or disrespectful. Say you have somebody who, the name on their birth certificate is Jonathan, but they're like, I don't really resonate with Jonathan all that much. I'd really rather just be called John. And if you are somebody that, they tell you, hey, I'd like to go by John, yet you go out of your way to call them Jonathan, 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 then, why aren't you respecting their nickname? It seems just disrespectful and unproductive. Yeah, I don't really see any reason why you shouldn't respect their nickname,
But
John.
don't you think that's kind of, for example, I'm okay with calling you Naomi
Mm-hmm.
because Naomi is a name that can be changed. That to me would be considered non-binary. A person can change their name, right?
Yeah.
But don't you think that I'm conservative, so don't you think as conservatives we have a point when we say, oh, you can't change your sex, so
Well,
going to address.
we're not talking about changing your sex. We're talking about changing your pronouns. Pronouns are words, just like names. So that's why it's more analogous to changing a name than it is to say changing your sex.
Right, but we use pronouns to identify your
I
sex.
would disagree with that. So,
Okay.
if you're thinking about biological sex, would you base that on some, say, like someone's genitals or chromosomes?
Mm-hmm.
So, if you say, like, see a woman in the store and you're like, oh, look at that woman over there. She's very pretty, for example. You didn't look at her chromosomes to know that she's a she. You didn't look at her genitals to know that she's a she. You observe her social presentation. You observe perhaps some, secondary external sex characteristics, ones that transsexual people can indeed change. If we're basing, it really doesn't seem that we're basing pronouns in some kind of like genital or chromosomal sex. Rather, they're much more at the social level. That we assign pronouns to people based off of how we get a kind of social read of them, of their presentation, of perhaps some of their external bodily features. I think it's just kind of silly to say that, like, oh, if I call someone a she, then I am referring to either the fact that they have a vagina or their capacity to give birth or two X chromosomes or whatever. You just don't know that about the people that you call she in your everyday
The
life.
way that someone present themselves is a good identifier to what they are, if they're what their sex is, correct?
I would certainly say that it's strongly correlated, but it's not a one-to-one relationship, as is shown by the existence of, say, transgender people, intersex people, transsexual people. Obviously there's going to be that very strong correlation, and nobody's denying that. But, if you're going to insist that I can only ever use she for somebody who has 2X chromosomes and the biological capacity to give birth, for example, well then under that definition, there would be plenty of intersex women who I'm pretty sure you and I would both consider women based off of how they look, based off of their lived experience, based off of most of their biology, yet they would not meet that biological criteria. Are we supposed to not call them she anymore?
When it comes to intersex people, they make up less than a fraction of the population, right? They don't have a choice. It's a medical condition. So intersex people aren't a good, you know, example for someone being trans because
Well, aren't we
intersex is a.
talking about the exceptional case? I obviously agree that in like,
Mhm.
at least 98% of cases, there's going to be that correlation between one's gender, the way they present themselves, and, the biological sex that they were assigned at birth. Right now, we're kind of talking about those exceptional cases or those edge cases where it's like, okay, say we're looking at that about 2% of the population where it's not that perfect correlation. How are we supposed to determine their pronouns then? And when we're talking about these exceptional cases, I think that intersex is absolutely applicable. Both intersex and trans people are those exceptional cases.
Right, intersex people, they just want to be normal, right? They just want
What do
to
you mean by
they they
normal?
they don't they wish that they weren't intersex. They want
That's
to
not
be the no.
true. Actually, there are plenty of intersex people who celebrate how they're unique in being intersex and think that it's fascinating and that they love being between the sexes. That's how their body naturally was supposed to be. That's how their genes naturally made them. And I think that intersex people should absolutely be celebrated for that very reason. There are many intersex conditions that, don't require any kind of extra medical intervention to live a normal, happy, healthy life. And so, I don't think that intersex is just something that we're supposed to quote unquote correct because there are plenty of intersex people that love their intersex bodies and we should celebrate those.
Being intersex is a medical condition, right? It isn't the normality, so it's not normal. And Most
Once
intersex
again, we're
people.
not talking about the normal case. We're talking about that 2%, right?
That's what I'm saying. Most intersex people, they don't want to be intersex. They wish
How do
that
you
they
know
could be.
that?
They wish that they could be either or.
What's
Most
your
of
source
them.
on that? Have you seen any kind of like survey or study on intersex people that says that most intersex people don't want to be intersex? Like, where's your source on that?
Well, I have a question for you. Do you think that most conjoined twins like to be joined together?
I'm not sure. I think you have to ask them.
Right. They don't. Most people
Well,
don't want to have a medical
do you have a
condition.
source on that? Like, did we ask intersex people if they like being intersex?
We ask them every day. If you go on YouTube, you'll see a lot of intersex people crying and just so sad about having to have both genitalia and not to knowing where they lie, not to
So
knowing
what's your
where.
source?
My source is people don't like to be fucked up. That's my source.
So I personally know intersex people that love their
Okay.
intersex bodies. If your source is I've just heard that some intersex people don't like being intersex, I know some intersex people that love being intersex.
Of course,
That
I'm
doesn't
pretty
really
sure.
paint that doesn't really paint a complete picture. Now, if you do have statistics or studies which show that most intersex people don't want to be intersex, I would love to see that. But you just asserted that without any evidence. Isn't that a little bit disingenuous?
No, because I know human nature. Is it a little bit disingenuous to think that that most people like to be fucked up? You know that
Well, here's
most
the
people.
thing. I don't think that
Okay.
intersex people are fucked up. I think that
Okay.
that's how their bodies just naturally are. And your appeal to this common human nature is an appeal to your own personal feelings. And look, I just think that the facts about how intersex people actually report their satisfaction in studies and research matters more than your feelings about whether or not intersex people are fucked up. Like, why are you putting your feelings above the
No,
facts?
it's a scientific fact that they're fucked up. It's
If it's a
sad.
scientific fact, can you point to any kind of like study or data which would show that most intersex people don't want to be
Of course,
intersex?
I can send you that after the show, but what I'm saying is this,
If you
and
have a study, I would love to see it. I'm happy to cite sources for claims that I
we
make.
can disagree with this, right? But being intersex is a mutation. That's a scientific fact. If you go
Yeah,
anywhere,
there's
they'll
nothing
tell you that.
necessarily wrong with a mutation. Many mutations are actually helpful or completely benign, as are many intersex conditions.
I agree with you, but being intersex is not benign. That's a huge situation.
Wait, you don't think that being intersex is completely benign?
No,
What
that's
about a condition
terrible.
where with such as Klinefelter's, where their life expectancy is just about the same as somebody who is not intersex? There is no kind of medical intervention which is necessary on people that have Klinefelter's, and their life expectancies turn out to be just normal. So
That's even more.
how is that something that is harmful?
That's even more rare. What I'm talking about is
Klinefelter's is
was
not as rare as you think, but here's the thing. You're trying to paint this picture of like all intersex people want to not be intersex without any proof, and now you're saying that like, oh, intersex is always going to be harmful without proof, when I'm showing you that yes, there do exist intersex conditions that don't require any medical intervention and that they live normal, happy, healthy lives. You know, I just hope that we can not make these kind of like absolutes when they're just not true, like what you're doing.
I didn't say all. I say most. I'm pretty sure there's some intersex people, like you said, that are happy to be intersex. I just think that most. And you're telling me to pull up my stats and data on. Well, then you tell me to. Well, you pull up your stats and data that most intersex people are happy being intersex.
I never made that claim. You were the
Right.
one that made the claim about most. My
Right.
claim was I don't know whether or not
Okay.
intersex people, most of them want to be intersex or most of them don't. But I told you what I do know is that there are many intersex people that are happy being intersex. So here's the thing. I'm not going to make a claim that most are this or most that without the data, but you're the one who is making claims about most without the data. That's the problem.
Okay, fair enough, right? I don't
Yeah.
have a problem with that. But here's the thing: being logical works is that if 1 + 1 = 2, then you know that 2 + 2 = 3. If someone has a
No,
genetic,
2 plus 2 is 4.
I mean 2 + 2 = 4. My bad. If someone has, if 1 + 1 = 2, 1 + 2 = 3, and 2 + 2 = 4, we
Good,
know
good.
that, right? So we know that um, people who have genetic abnormalities tend to be shunned by their community. They don't like that. Even for example, when I speak with
Wait
gay
a
people,
minute.
they say,
That's actually a really great point. I'm actually so glad you brought that up. It is true that lots of people are shunned for being intersex, even in cases where there's, no kind of like medical problem with being intersex. That's not a problem with the biological reality of being intersex. That's a problem with society. One that if we as a society were more tolerant and accepting of people that had diverse sex characteristics, that had diverse forms of gender presentation, then we could resolve those issues that these intersex people are facing. That's actually a wonderful point. That would help intersex people, that would help trans people, that would help gender nonconforming people. I'm really glad you brought up that point. I agree absolutely.
So I don't even need to use the gay example about how they're shunned sometimes. I feel for intersex people. That's why I don't like to use them in these conversations. From a logical analysis, if I know 1 + 1 = 2 and 1 + 2 = 3, I know that most people don't want to be like that. Most people wish that they
So
could
I'm not sure how 1 + 1 = 2 is in any way related to whether or not somebody wants to be intersex. The reason why I bring up intersex people in these conversations is because I care about intersex people. I see how these systems of gender policing, these systems of sex policing, which we have in our society, hurt intersex people. They're common systems that hurt both intersex people and trans people. And as somebody who cares deeply about the intersex community, I want to advocate for, social systems and medical systems that are better able to meet their needs. I saw one of your videos talking about medical courses. It was specifically about your video was titled Harvard Transgender Infants, where you discussed Harvard's new course, Caring for Patients with Diverse Sexual Orientations, Gender Identities, and Sex Development. You had this completely wrong idea about what this course was about. And kind of this misinformation which you're spreading can really hurt intersex people. In this video, you made the claim that this is quite literally insane. They want you to believe that infants can be LGBTQ. That means that they're saying that infants can be lesbian, gay, and even transgender. We're living in clown world, upside down world. This is proof that college is nothing but a facility to brainwash the masses. However, if you actually look at the course catalog of the course that you were reporting on, they're just teaching the fact about the world that some babies are intersex and that they might have unique medical needs because of the fact that they're intersex. All this misinformation about intersex babies, it can end up spreading into your videos even, and I think that's very unfortunate.
I'll change up my content if you can convince me and prove me wrong. I have no problem with that.
Awesome. Yeah, I would sincerely hope you would take down that video because you are wrong about the content of that course. The course nowhere claims that babies can be transgender or gay. What it's talking about is sexual minority people, intersex people, and there are infants who are intersex.
We're going to talk about the intersex thing, right?
Awesome. Yeah, I love intersex people.
You said that they need special medical care, right?
They might have extra medical needs because of their intersex. If your kind of internal anatomy might differ than what is typical, then, in terms of kind of reproductive healthcare, in terms of kind of hormonal healthcare, you might have unique medical needs.
I'm going to break it down like this, right? And to show you my point of view, you don't have to agree with me, but
please.
This may seem far off, but why do people need braces for their teeth? Why do people need braces?
Why do people need braces? Typically, it would be for kind of an aesthetic appeal.
Right. Aesthetic appeal to do what?
To make their teeth straight, to fit some kind of ideal of their own body.
That means that they aren't happy with having crooked teeth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with intersex people. You can't say that, and this is what my opinion. Of course, some people like having crooked teeth. Oh, I love having crooked teeth. I love these gaps in my teeth. I love not being, aesthetically pleased. We know that if most people, and you say, well, you just pulling these statistics out of nowhere, but we know if most people could have straight teeth.
I'm not sure. I don't have the data, but
right.
I would assume probably yes.
Right, and that's how probably because 1 + 1 = 2. See,
that has nothing to do with 1 + 1. But please go on.
because that people like to look appealing, so that most people probably will want straight teeth. So that's like 1 + 1 = 2. So I guess they might want straight teeth, and that's how I see intersex people. Well, I know that they want to be appealing. They want to be pleasing. They want to.
I think that this is actually a great example. If there's an intersex person who, as a teenager, with talking to doctors and therapists, decides that, they're maybe uncomfortable with some of their intersex traits, they might want to take hormones or, get some kind of surgery, through this kind of long informed consent process with medical diagnoses. I have no problem with an intersex person that genuinely wants to change their body. The important part of there is the medical consent. The big problem with intersex people is that so often there are intersex surgeries which are performed on infants without their consent, surgeries which are often completely medically unnecessary, surgeries where often the medical risks outweigh the medical benefits. And I think that's a real problem. It's not like we're putting braces on babies. If we were putting braces on their babies without consent, I think I might be a little bit uncomfortable about that. But if they're like a teenager who's been talking to doctors and therapists, then yeah, I have absolutely no problem with that. And so I'm really glad you brought up that example. I think it really does kind of show where the line is.
I think you make a good point there. That's why I don't really talk about intersex people, because to me that's a gray area. Sometimes they may get this surgery, they may do surgeries on babies, and then later on in life, those babies realize that they didn't want the surgery.
Yeah,
so
that's messed up.
I agree with that. That's why I don't really talk about intersex people.
Just to clarify, you would indeed be okay with someone who's like an intersex teenager, say, going on hormones in order to fit kind of like what they want their ideal body to be, if they're talking to like doctors and therapists over an extended period of time.
Yeah, intersex
awesome.
people are...
I agree 100%. And I'm going to take it a step further. So why not apply the exact same standard of care to trans teenagers? Trans teenagers also want to take hormones to fit an ideal body, one that is shown in the medical literature to improve their mental health and overall well-being. And if you're okay with intersex teenagers doing it with the help of doctors and therapists over an extended period of time, then we should also be okay with trans teenagers doing it with the help of doctors and therapists over an extended period of time.
I think that's apples and oranges.
How so?
Those trans kids who aren't 18 years old, who doesn't even have the frontal cortex fully developed.
Well, neither do the intersex teenagers.
But see, those are special cases.
Trans people are also special cases.
Intersex people have a physical condition, while trans people have a mental condition. To treat a physical condition, of course, you got to treat them physically. To treat a mental condition, you got to get those people some therapy.
There are lots of mental conditions we do treat with physical substances, such as antidepressants, such as ADHD meds. There are lots of times where we prescribe physical medication that induces physical and sometimes even permanent changes in the brain and body to teenagers, like antidepressants, like ADHD meds. I really just don't see it as any different. If you're going to bring up, like, say, an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, well, an intersex teenager, they have an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, yet you're perfectly okay with them taking hormones with the help of doctors and therapists. That's precisely why we get doctors and therapists involved, following standards of care, such that we can account for, people that need the help of doctors and therapists in order to provide truly informed consent.
I agree with you about it's no different. I don't see any difference with giving these kids ADHD meds either. Like, I don't agree with that. I'm against Big Pharma. I think it's all to make money. I'm against Big Pharma, 100%.
If I can hop in right here, I think that there's a big distinction between Big Pharma and the medical research community. So I myself, as a leftist, I am absolutely opposed to Big Pharma. I think that running healthcare for profit is disastrous. I would absolutely nationalize the Big Pharma industry if I was given the chance. That way we can afford to give people the medicine they need, the medicine that they benefit from, at the cheapest price point possible, with no kind of interference from insurance bidding, from market manipulation. I would want to get rid of all of that. Now, if we're talking about medical research and what types of medicines people actually benefit from, that's an entirely different subject. Whether or not Big Pharma is corrupt in their market manipulation has nothing to do with whether or not teenagers or adults will benefit from a certain type of medication. And if you look at the actual research we have on these topics, kind of like the clinical trials, the studies which show whether or not people benefit from medication, it is absolutely the case. Teenagers who are diagnosed with depression benefit from antidepressants. That improves their mental health and improves their well-being and improves their social functioning. The same thing is true about ADHD kids that take ADHD meds. The same thing is true about intersex people who desire to change sex characteristics that are allowed to. The same thing is true about trans people who desire to medically transition when they're teenagers who are allowed to. So, I'm absolutely with you. Big Pharma is a big problem, and we should deal with that market manipulation and price gouging in every extent that we can. But at the same time, I trust the doctors and scientists working out of public universities and hospitals to do medical research into what medicines actually benefit people, because those are completely unrelated to the profit motives of Big Pharma.
Are you telling me that because someone takes drugs and it makes them happy, then the drugs are necessary and they work and they're good because it makes the person feel better? Are you telling me that?
If it's in the long term, yes. If it's something where it's just like a short-term benefit but a long-term detriment, then no. Obviously somebody who takes, say, like an illegal substance might feel happy in the short term, but it can be very harmful in the long term. So that's why I think it's important to look at, longer-term, more extensive studies on these subjects, which we absolutely do have for even trans healthcare.
And Lupron is bad for children. Long term, it destroys the kid's body. It makes their bone weak. It's harmless to it.
What's your source on that? That it lowers their bone density to a harmful extent in the long term.
I can send you the sources later, but
please send me the source right now. Can you give me like the title of the paper? I'm happy to look it up because I've seen the data on puberty blockers, and what I've seen is that in the long term, after they stop taking puberty blockers, their bone density jumps right back up to a perfectly healthy standpoint. And in the longest term studies we've seen, I saw that it was like, if you take like the normal bone density average is like right here, say like right here, then for those that were on puberty blockers, it was just like slightly underneath it, but still at a healthy level. You know, if it were the case where it was at an unhealthy level in the long term, then I think that would warrant some further investigation. But all of the long-term studies I've seen, they end up at a perfectly healthy level after they've been off of the puberty blockers for years, after they've, now going through a puberty and their bone density improves.
That's not what every source says, okay?
Okay, what's your source then?
Let's just write that. You could pull that up for me. Okay, so
what's your source then? If that's not what every source says, can you please provide a counter source?
Right, that he's on it because I'm trying to debate you. I don't want to go through while we're talking. What about the other issues, like stopping a kid's sexual development? That's damage. That's bad. That's
How
what
is that
Lupron
damaging?
Is for. Huh?
How is that damaging? It resumes just perfectly naturally once they stop the puberty blockers.
No, when you stop a kid's sexual development, that's terrible. It doesn't resume
What's
normally.
your evidence that it's terrible?
Halting someone's sexual development, what's my evidence that that's bad?
Yeah, what's your evidence?
Nature dictates that.
Because it resumes just perfectly naturally and normally as soon as they stop the medicine. So, who cares if their sexual development starts at age 10 versus age 12? It really doesn't matter. I mean, kids go through puberty at different ages, right?
If I'm a 30-year-old adult and I just got and I stopped taking Lupron,
nobody stays on puberty blockers till age 30.
Right.
For trans teenagers, they're only allowed to go on it for like a year or two max. You would know that if you looked into the studies, right?
No.
You seem to have this idea that like people are going on to Lupron until the age of 30, but if you actually looked at the studies, like you claim to have done with Lupron, you would know that they only take it for like a year or two, right?
No. But what I'm saying is, aside from Lupron, you have to go through hormone therapy if you want to.
You don't have to go through hormone therapy. It's just an option if they'd like to go through it.
So if I'm taking Lupron as a kid, and then I continue to take different drugs to make sure that I don't mature as let's say a man doesn't mature as to be a man, like he's a trans woman. If he makes sure that he doesn't mature, you don't think that that's harmful, or you just think that's
I think that it
normal?
depends on the person. I think that if it is a cisgender man, then it would be harmful for them to, be forced to go on estrogen. But if this person is indeed a transgender woman, like myself, then they would absolutely benefit from estrogen, and that's what the medical literature shows. If these people have better mental health outcomes in the long term, which is what the empirical studies show, then that doesn't seem like a harm at all to me. That actually seems like it's helping them. It's improving their mental health. It's reducing the rates at which they unalive themselves. It improves their social outcomes, their overall well-being in the long term. We actually have studies which show that when trans teenagers are allowed to go on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, their mental health outcomes closely match that of cisgender children. Yet I'm sure you've heard about, trans people and the really high unaliving rates they have. Yet when you look at the specific portion of the trans population that is supported by their friends and family, that is allowed to talk to doctors and therapists, that is allowed to go on the medication, which all of the major medical institutions and their established guidelines support with, proper diagnoses and therapy and treatment, then their mental health outcomes are just as good as cisgender children. And I can provide you a study which provides that exact claim.
Yeah, as long as it's not buzzed.
I have a peer-reviewed study. I can find that for you right here. Go ahead and grab that. Do you want that study?
You can send it to me later. We don't have to pull up studies.
Yeah. I know you're not interested in studies in general. That's okay.
No, I'm interested in studies. I'm definitely going to look at it. I just don't want to interrupt the screen. I'm gonna take what you're saying as at face value. Okay, I'm going to assume that you're not a liar.
And, here we go. I found the study right here.
Okay, I'm gonna look at it. And I assume that you're not a liar. So
yes, this was from the Journal of the American Academy Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. The article is titled "Mental Health and Self-Worth in Socially Transitioned Transgender Youth" by Lily Durwood, BA, as the first author.
Okay, cool. there's studies contradicting both my and your points. I
What are
get
the studies that
I'm
contradict my points?
okay. We're gonna move on
Because
to.
I actually haven't seen any studies which show that gender transition harms trans people. Can you point to any study that says that? Like, can you give me one study?
This is a study. If I chop a little boy's wing off, that's bad.
That's not a
That's not
study.
good.
That's not a peer-reviewed study published in an academic journal. Like you
Okay,
don't have a study. That's the point.
okay.
I cited a study for you. I can cite entire systematic literature reviews, collections of peer-reviewed study,
Mm.
but you can't even cite a single study which shows that gender transition is harmful.
I'm going to bust you up with logic, okay? I'm going to use logic, and I'm going to
Well,
use.
do you care about facts?
I care
So
about facts.
you made the claim that there are studies which contradict what I'm saying. So
Yeah.
can you point to one single study which contradicts what I'm saying?
I could, but I don't have to because I'm not doing
You don't
that
have
right
to,
now.
but you made the claim that you can. So
I
why
made the
can't
claim.
you?
I made the claim that chopping a little boy's wing off, putting children on unnecessary drugs is bad. It's harmful to their
But
bodies.
wait, we're not talking about chopping people's wee off. We're not talking about putting people on an unnecessary medication. We're talking about putting people on medication which is in the medical literature, in the empirical studies, demonstrated to improve their mental health and overall well-being. And look, I care about the mental health of teenagers, and I hope you would too. So why don't we follow what the medical literature and the established medical guidelines, which are backed by research, show we can do to help trans teenagers?
You think that I'm disagreeing with you that it makes these people happier? I never said it doesn't. Just because someone is happy at the time being doesn't make it good. I
So
understand what you're saying. Well,
do you
these
want like a
people,
long-term study? Would that show that yes, they are happy in the long term? That's a good thing.
being happy doesn't make it good. Long term, that's why we have detransitioners. People can change their mind. We could come back to
Wait,
this
what
particular.
would it take to convince you then? If you think that like being happy is not like the metric, like what is the metric that we need to look for to determine whether or not medical transition is beneficial for these trans teenagers? What like by what metric should we evaluate whether or not we should provide this care?
I don't think that I could ever be convinced that medically transitioning would be good. I think because
So
you
you
have to
just
understand.
made up your mind before even looking into something? That
No,
seems incredibly bad faith. I could be convinced that medical transition is not a good idea if the empirical studies show that it harmed the mental health of trans people, showed that it harmed their well-being, then I would be opposed to it. I'm open to listening, and if you can demonstrate that, the consensus of the scholarly research is that, yeah, this is not a really good idea, then I can be convinced. But if you are admitting you can't be convinced, then that just seems very disingenuous and very closed-minded. Why not open yourself up and think about, like, what would it actually take for me to be on board with a certain type of medicine? How do we determine whether or not it's a good idea to prescribe a certain type of medicine to someone? By what standard should we assess this?
Let's say you were a doctor and someone came to you and said that I would be much happier if I didn't have arms and legs. Because they'd be much happier that they didn't have arms and legs. Would you then proceed to say, you know what, let's schedule you for an appointment to get your arms and legs removed?
You're talking about body identity integrity disorder, and I think
Yes.
that this is actually a really complicated and nuanced medical topic. Ultimately, my guiding principle is that I want to cause the least amount of harm, the least amount of suffering that we can. The medical literature on body identity integrity disorder is rather complicated. It seems to be the case that people with this condition have neurological damage that is very similar to the kind of neurological damage which can cause stroke patients to lose feeling in their arms and legs. And it has been shown that through sensory reeducation therapy, this is an established medical guideline, they can regain a sense of connection with that body part that they want to lose. I would recommend that we follow the established medical guidelines which are backed by research, which are shown that this is our best option for reducing harm, for improving their mental health and overall well-being. Meanwhile, in the case of trans people, it seems to be the case that there really isn't any kind of like gender re-education therapy which works, which makes them no longer be trans. That's conversion therapy, and conversion therapy has been shown to actually worsen their mental health and worsen those outcomes. I think we really have to analyze this on a case-by-case basis based off of what reduces harm. And so in the case of body identity integrity disorder, it seems that sensory reeducation therapy is our best line of defense for helping them to feel congruent with their body. Meanwhile, in trans people, conversion therapy doesn't work. It worsens their mental health. It worsens their unaliving rates, allowing them to transition after they have been diagnosed through this lengthy process with doctors and therapists. That is what best improves their mental health and overall well-being. So I'm glad that you brought up this case, because that actually really shows where the boundaries are at. The boundaries are at what causes harm versus what helps people. And I just want to help as many people as we can. So if I'm a doctor, I'm going to look into the research, look into the established guidelines, and figure out what are my best options for helping people and reducing harm.
Yeah, I think they need mental help. Okay, so let's go to the that's what I think, and we know what you think. But let's go to I think what was very interesting about the grocery store situation is that you said, well, if someone present themselves in a way, like if a woman is in a grocery store and she presents herself as a woman, then you're going to say she. But here's the thing, though, and you may disagree with this. I haven't watched your content yet. So certain trans people may say, and actually, I think you actually probably touched on this. Certain trans people may say, well, even though I present masculine, call me she, call me her. What about that? What about those cases?
Yeah, I literally just don't care. Honestly, like, I see it much how I see nicknames. If Jonathan wants to go by John, I don't care. I'll call him John. If this person wants to go by she, I don't care. I'll call them she. When I brought up the grocery store example, my point was to show that our common use of pronouns of seeing somebody and, like going with, oh, I'm trying to call this person she, I'm going to call this he, that we don't do that based off of what genitals or chromosomes we have. We typically do that based on our social presentation. But just me personally, if somebody wants to go by a certain pronoun or a certain nickname, I really don't care. So, like, why should we really care all that much? It just doesn't seem like a big deal to me.
We feel as though we're being forced to play into your delusion.
And I'm not forcing you to do anything. I'm just saying that I don't really care if somebody wants to go by a certain pronoun, and it's no sweat off my back. And so if it's something that's going to make them happy, just like going by a nickname, I think it's silly to insist on not using their nickname, just like somebody insisting on not using the pronouns they want to go by. I just don't see why you should care all that much.
Because remember what I said about your pronouns reflects your sex.
But we just established that chromosomes aren't based off of what somebody's genitals are. They aren't based off of what somebody's chromosomes are.
But you established that your pronouns are based off how someone presents themselves. So I brought up how
I want to be clear. I established that's how we assume or perhaps initially assign pronouns. For a lot of people, if they're, say, corrected on somebody's pronouns, they'll typically just switch to the ones they're corrected to. Like, if there's, say, somebody who looks kind of more androgynous, and you're like, oh, excuse me, miss, and they're like, actually, it's Mr., you're probably going to be like, oh, my bad, my dude, and then just call them he and move on. It seems to be how most people act, and I think that making a big deal out of it, where if this person's like, oh, actually, it's Mr., and then you go out of your way to be like, well, listen here, little missy, I don't know. I just feel like that's very aggressive in a way that's completely unnecessary in something where you might be wrong. I would just err on the side of caution and just err on the side of respect and be like, if somebody wants to go by he, I don't care. They can go by he. It's fine by me. No sweat off my back.
Are they basing the pronouns off of then? See, if I'm a logical thinking person, I say, well, your pronouns are based off of your sex, your chromosomes. It's based off that. You say, well, no, your pronouns aren't based off that. So then what are you basing the pronouns off of?
So typically, the way that this will work is we assume what someone's pronouns are based off of their social presentation, based off of some of their external biological characteristics, and then typically, if corrected, we go by what we're corrected with. That seems to be kind of typically how people assign pronouns, is they have this initial mental assumption, and then if they're corrected, they change what they're saying. That kind of seems to be how it works in practice. I think that that's a perfectly functional system where I don't have a problem if somebody, assumes what somebody's pronouns are or uses a gendered term. But, if you are corrected by somebody, I just don't see why you should make a big stink out of it. I would just go with the correction and move on.
No, because I want to know what the pronouns are based off of. So if someone is...
I just told you. I said it's initially based on an assumption, based off of how you perceive their social presentation, kind of with respect to gender, and based off of perhaps some external biological characteristics. That's what it's initially based on, that assumption. Mm-hmm. As a kind of second line of defense, we base it off of somebody's stated identity or how they correct you if you, say, assume differently than how they view themselves.
No, that's what I'm saying. Like, them. What are they basing it off of? If I'm basing it off of how they present themselves initially, what makes them... So if a man, Yeah, if a person is presenting themselves as masculine, and I say, "Excuse me, sir," and they say, "No, it's not sir, it's ma'am." What gives them the right to tell me that they should be called ma'am? What
Oh,
are they
I
basing that
understand
off
what you're
of?
saying now. They're basing that off of their own gender identity. There's this person that presents masculine, and they're like, oh, actually, I'm a woman. You don't know if that's, say, a trans woman, or say even just like a butch cisgender woman. You don't know for certain whether or not they're trans or whether or not they're just a butch cis woman. And so that's why, trying to base it off of something other than their own stated identity is just kind of weird once they correct you.
And what gives them the right to identify as something that they aren't?
How do you know that they're not that? They could be a butch cisgender woman.
But if they have a penis, if they have male chromosomes, what gives them the right to say I'm a woman?
Because
How did they
gender
get to
because
identify
gender
as
is a
that?
social category. It's not
Okay.
just a strictly biological category. Obviously, there are so many gendered traits and gendered characteristics. Man and woman, we broadly use these terms to refer to mostly social classes of people, not just strictly biological classes. If somebody, for all intents and purposes, wants to live their life as a member of a certain social class, I think it's a very valid reason for them to desire that kind of pronoun. And if
Okay.
that's how they genuinely identify, I just don't think we should care all that much.
Watch enough videos on trans people, and I pretty much know what you're getting at. You're saying that gender and sex are two different things. Gender is how you feel, how you identify, and sex is your biological traits. You agree with that, right?
Almost. I would say that gender is not just a feeling or an identity. That would be gender identity. When we use
Okay.
gender, broadly what we're referring to is a social phenomenon, which are kind of like the relationships which are different and often unequal between men and women in a given society in kind of a cultural context. Various ideas of who might be the gender that's supposed to wear their hair long versus short, who's supposed to hold doors open for someone, which colors we might consider gendered. This goes down into like micro-specific behaviors or readings that kind of happen between genders. Like if you're a guy walking down the street and you see another guy, they'll typically do this like head nod kind of thing when looking past each other, but women don't do that. Women typically will do like a little smile or like a little wave when walking past each other. There are so many of these kind of just like social relationships, social roles, social expectations. I think when we're using the term gender, we're more so referring to those social roles, social expectations, social relationships, which are sometimes explicit, sometimes made very clear, but oftentimes are very implicit, very, subconscious. I also obviously recognize that sometimes when people say the term gender or say man or woman, they are referring to biology. Sometimes when they say the term gender, say the term woman, they're referring to a gender identity. Those do kind of get conflated. If that's kind of the descriptive use case of gender, where sometimes people talk about biology, sometimes people talk about sociology, sometimes people talk about psychology, I think that those are all valid uses of the term gender. But I do think that when we're using the term gender, we're mostly using it in that social sense.
I disagree with the idea that someone has a certain gender based off if they nod at someone or if they smile at someone or how
I don't
they
think that
present.
determines someone's gender. I think that it's certainly a gendered aspect which we can broadly recognize in society. It's really hard to say that like one individual characteristic determines one's gender, because gender refers to lots of different social relationships and social roles and social expectations.
I disagree with all of them, but we're going to get into that.
You don't think that there's like a gendered expectation that women wear their hair long and men wear their hair short? Or like a gendered expectation that like pink is a girly color and blue is a boyish color?
I disagree that those things determine your gender.
I never said that those determine your gender. When we use the term gender, we're often referring to these kind of like arbitrary or social traits or social roles and expectations.
Who's we?
As a society, just kind of like in the descriptive use of language of the word gender.
Oh, no, because the people I know, when they say gender, they're referring to sex.
Do you agree that, there's kind of this notion that like pink is a girlish color and blue is a boyish color?
By society, yes.
How is that related to biological sex?
When we have these gender reveal parties, we're talking about the sex of the child.
Yeah, but
And
why
based off
is blue? What does blue have to do with being male, and what does pink have to do with being female? Because it actually it used to be flip-flopped. If you go back a couple decades, it used to be the case that pink was the boy's color and blue was the girl's color. How is that in any way related to biological sex?
It's not, but our society.
Exactly. You're onto it. You're onto it. Go ahead.
Our society determines that, okay, this is going to be for boys, this is going to be for girls, just based off of our history and stuff. So it becomes part of our culture. So
Yes.
when we see a little boy though, and he likes Barbie dolls or he likes the color pink, what we say is that that boy is effeminate. We don't say that, oh, he must be a girl. We
I
don't.
agree.
That's why I disagree with the notion that gender is based off all of these different traits and characteristics, not just that, like how you said, not just that one trait that, oh, if you nod at someone, then you must be a man. No, all of these traits and characteristics, I disagree that that determines someone's gender, or
So
that
I
can,
don't think you're listening to me. I
or-
never
or-
said that determines their gender.
or-
I've already clarified twice that I didn't say that determines one's gender.
or
but
that- that's a good
it seems that broadly you are recognizing, yeah, there are all these social aspects of gender which get tied into the roles and expectations we assign to men and women, to boys and girls. It seems that you are on the right track by recognizing that there is no biological basis for the fact that our society considers pink to be a girl's color and blue to be a boy's color. There is no biological basis for the fact that our society thinks that it's more normal for a woman to wear her hair long than for a man to wear his hair long. This shows that you do indeed recognize a difference between biological sex and these societal notions of gender. I'm not saying that this like determines or like sets in stone one's gender. That gender broadly refers to these societal notions or these societal relationships.
Fair enough. Then what does determine someone's gender?
What determines someone's gender? I think that we would have to be a little bit more specific. If we're asking about what determines someone's gender, are you asking what determines their biological sex? What determines kind of the social roles and expectations which society assigns or expects of them? Or are you asking what determines their gender identity?
Yeah. No. What I'm saying is the biological sex, we've already determined for the sake of this conversation, which I think that gender and sex are used interchangeably.
They are used interchangeably sometimes, but gender is also more often used to describe social relationships.
I understand that certain things like the color blue and the color pink, they have no real meaning as far as when it comes to a person's sex. But certain things like gender roles are important, and that's based off a person's sex, right? So let's say, at one point of time, or just say men in construction, right? You could say, oh, it's a gender role for men to do construction work, but biologically, they're more physically fit to do that kind of work. Or we could say, how at some point in time when the world was still normal and good, women would stay at home and be stay-at-home wives, and they'll take care of the children, and the men will go out and work. Nature has intended for us to do that since the beginning of human civilization. When a man goes out, he goes out to hunt, and a woman takes care of home. That's how we evolved, and that's why sex is so important. And so we say, well, society created these gender roles, but society didn't create all of these gender roles.
I think that it's a bit disingenuous to suggest that these are entirely based on sex. There absolutely are some women out there that have more muscle mass, that have more strength than certain men. And these women might be better suited to be hunters. They might be better suited to be construction workers than, say, some scrawnier men are. And if you go back to hunter-gatherer societies, which are a wonderful example, it wasn't the case that everybody with a penis was always going to be a hunter and everybody with a vagina was always going to be a gatherer or like somebody staying at home taking care of the kids. These were much more so generalities, but they recognize exceptional cases. They recognize, hey, sometimes there are strong women that they want to go out and be hunters. These are much more so gender roles rather than sex roles, where obviously because there's this very strong correlation between gender and sex, for say probably at least 98% of people, their gender corresponds with their sex. There are people that fall outside of that, and the fact that, they might do gender atypical behavior or roles shows that these roles aren't just, a one-to-one sex role, but rather they're much more so kind of a social, cultural role, a gender role. It's not entirely based on one's biological sex. I think that's a really great example, precisely because it shows that, yeah, this does happen to be true in kind of like the general case or in most cases, but when we look at the exceptional cases, the gender nonconforming people, trans people, intersex people, say, for example, it really doesn't make sense to call these just exactly sex roles that are entirely based on sex, where there's no deviation from them.
The strongest man in the world is stronger than the strongest woman in the world. It's just simple.
Probably, yeah.
Regardless of if people want to try to say, well, sex doesn't matter, it's how you identify.
I don't think that sex doesn't matter. Actually,
Okay.
The fact that I recognize that there are going to be these general correlations with sex, and yeah, it is true that most men have more muscle mass than most women, and this might make them, more advantageous on average in certain jobs, such as, say, construction or heavy lifting. I just don't think that it's an absolute sex marker. Sex is much more so kind of like bimodal, where it's like you have two kind of like rough averages, but there are absolutely people that like overlap or lie in the middle. So we can say that like muscle mass is, plotted on this line where there's kind of the female average over here, there's kind of the male average over here, but you'll find that there are some males that are more similar to kind of a female muscle mass. There are some females that are more similar to kind of a male muscle mass. Kind of like sex segregate roles just seems very silly, because I want the strong men and the strong women working in the more strong kind of like physical labor positions. I want the people that might be more dexterous or more, you know, say that they have like coding skills or something, working in those kind of more like technical professions. I think that we should just base this much more so off of personal attributes, whatever their best skill is at, rather than just, you know, making kind of like some absolute claim about their sex.
I think that sex is important, correct?
Yeah, sex is absolutely real, and it certainly matters in many contexts. Mostly in the medical context.
Why is it so wrong for me to address someone by their sex?
It just seems really weird, because we don't really interact at that kind of like biological level. When you're interacting with someone in society, in public, you're interacting at a social level, at a gendered level. When you're talking to someone at the grocery store, you don't know what's in their pants. You don't know what their chromosomes are. What you do know is how they present themselves socially. Our interactions between people, those are at the social level, not at the biological level. You know, it just seems kind of weird to be referring to somebody's genitals or chromosomes when you're just talking with them at, say, the grocery store. Right?
No, I don't think it's weird. I mean,
you don't think it's weird to talk about someone's genitals in the grocery store?
You're being funny right now. That's not what I said. I don't think it's weird to address someone by their biological sex in the grocery store.
When you refer to addressing someone by their biological sex, do you mean like she or her, or do you mean like hello fellow penis haver?
No, that's what trans people do. They say birthing bodies and things like that. I think that's weird.
Are they doing that in the grocery store, or are they doing that in a medical paper? Because those are very different contexts.
Oh no, I think they do that. They do that everywhere, like on Twitter and stuff. Oh, birthing bodies are real and this and that.
Are they talking about that in like a medical context, or in like a social context? Because in like a social context, yeah, I would agree it's kind of weird to talk about like a birthing person, or maybe even like a pregnant person. I don't really think that there's typically a need to point out that, hey, she's pregnant when you're like at the grocery store, or hey, he has a penis in like a grocery store. In these kind of social settings, we're often much more so referring to social characteristics, social titles, names, pronouns. Those operate at the social level, not the biological level. But in, say, like a medical research paper, that's actually where you'll see more of this biological terminology used. You'll see words like transsexual to refer to the biology of, say, like a medically transitioned trans person. You'll see words like, you know, a pregnant person to refer to somebody who is pregnant. And I think that using these more objective terms is actually a really good thing in the medical literature. If you say just like use the term woman to mean, say, like a pregnant person, that's actually a little bit imprecise in, say, like a medical research paper, because, well, there are also intersex people who can get pregnant. There are also non-binary people who can get pregnant. There are transsexual males who can get pregnant. And so using a more objective term to refer to this group of people precisely in the medical literature makes more sense. But in kind of like a social setting, you know, I think that using social terms is much more applicable and makes more sense.
What I'm saying is, right, there's nothing wrong with me addressing someone by their biological sex. It is scientifically the correct thing to do.
How are you addressing someone by their biological sex?
By using their pronouns, right?
Well, so pronouns aren't addressing someone by their biological sex, as we've already established.
We use pronouns to address them by their biological sex.
But wait a minute. When you call someone she, you don't know whether or not they have a vagina or whether or not they have two X chromosomes.
We're assuming that that's their biological sex. If I find out that that's she...
that sure sounds like you're making a gender distinction, not a sex distinction.
No, I'm talking about their chromosomes. I'm going to be straightforward.
You know someone's chromosomes and you call them she?
Yes. I assume that's their chromosomes.
There are actually even cisgender women who have XY chromosomes sometimes.
I assume that there are naturally...
If you find out that this cisgender woman actually has XY chromosomes, are you supposed to call her a he now?
To be fair, I did let you talk, to be fair. And every time when I try to talk, you cut me off, to be fair. So allow me to get my point out first, and then you can reply, okay? Here's what I'm saying, right? We use pronouns to determine someone, to address someone by what we believe is their biological sex. So if I see a trans woman, and let's say I'm convinced, which I've never been convinced before, but let's just say I'm convinced in this situation, and I see someone say, hey, you know, I'm a woman, and this person is a woman. Then later, and I say, oh, she this, her that, she this, her that. I'll be using those pronouns. Then later, I found out that that person has been deceiving people, saying that this person is a woman, but can come to find out this person is a trans woman. I'm going to start saying he, because that's how that person was born. Now you could say, oh, what about those rare cases where someone has the X and Y chromosomes, but their bodies are natural female? Okay, whatever. Those are rare conditions, extremely rare conditions. So we're talking about people who are naturally born with a penis has S and Y chromosomes. People who are naturally born with a vagina has SS chromosomes. And I found out that information, and I know that person is born with a penis and that person is born with a vagina. I'm going to address them by that. That's what I'm going to call them by with pronouns. Now, how a person feels to me, how a person self-identifies, it doesn't matter, because if a person self-identifies as a butterfly, I wouldn't say, well, that person is a butterfly. I'm going to address this person as a butterfly. No, I'm not going to do that.
Are you done?
Yeah.
Just to kind of like jump into it. I just think that you're deeply misguided if you think that we generally use pronouns to refer to someone's biological sex. And the edge cases really illustrate why that just doesn't make sense. Like we've already established, when you assume someone's pronouns, you do so based off of your social read of them. You're, looking at their presentation, perhaps looking at some of their external characteristics. You don't know anything about their chromosomes. You don't know anything about their genitals. And it just seems really silly to think that, like, learning what somebody's chromosomes are should change, like, how you refer to them, because there are cisgender women that have XY chromosomes. In this case, it's like you've been calling them she, you've known them as a woman your entire life, and then later on you find out that they have XY chromosomes. Why should you not not keep calling them she? It just seems counterintuitive and counterproductive to call someone something different just because you find out that they have certain chromosomes that you might have not expected them to have. We don't interact as chromosomes. We don't interact as genitals when we're using pronouns. Pronouns are a construct of language. They're a construct of society. They operate at this social level, not at a biological level. When you're talking to someone at the grocery store, you really just don't know that. And, I don't know how we got to, like, identifying as butterflies, because that's not even what we're talking about here. We're just talking about the use of language that has nothing to do with what species somebody is.
She and her is referring to what? That someone is a woman, correct?
Yeah, it would be referring to the gender of woman.
Okay, what is a woman?